Thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate the flexibility in accommodating the schedule, because this is a very important topic before us today, as I think that the variety of questions today will spotlight. I approached this with some relatively recent experience and conversations about the role of open source technologies in the election space. Many people, who want to really digest the integrity of our elections broadly are focused on the integrity of voting systems and the underlying technologies, which are primarily closed source, of movement to advance open source voting systems for purposes of transparency and public confidence in that unique sector. But appreciate the opportunity to weigh in this hearing. At the end of the day, one of the fundamental questions that we can ask is, what can Congress and the federal government do to help address any underlying vulnerabilities that exist within the open source ecosystem? But beyond what government can do, I think it's also important to ask, what is industry doing and what more can industry do? As you all know, much of our software ecosystem is built on the use of open source code. Large companies, including but not limited to Cisco and others, are able to grow themselves and their proprietary products because of the work done through open source collaboration. One concern with this type of model is that it can potentially lead to a free rider problem. What does that mean? That means companies can reap massive benefits from open source software that collaboration makes possible without necessarily any obligation to contribute to its development or maintenance, or in situations like we're discussing today, remediation. So I understand that that's not every company, and that many companies actually do make sizable contributions to collectives like Apache and Linux and others that help maintain some open source software products. But it isn't every company that does so. So I'd like to ask each of you, in your opinion, is private industry doing enough to help develop, maintain, and when necessary, remediate the open source ecosystem? And what more should we expect our private companies to be doing to ensure that open source can remain a collaborative, decentralized system?
Thank you, Senator Padilla. It's an interesting question, and one that's been discussed for a number of years in the open source community, specifically that free rider problem. And it is the Apache Software Foundation takes the point of view that we do not require, we don't ship our software with any obligation to contribute back. And our mission is to distribute software free of charge for the public to use. And so we consider it accomplishing our mission when it is broadly used. We believe that enlightened self-interest will inform industry to begin contributing. And indeed, in response to this, we're seeing greatly increased contribution around security auditing and code validation in the Log4J and a number of other open source projects. I do think that incidents like this will continue to enlighten the industry, that they have their own self-interest to protect. And by doing so, that the easiest way to do that is to contribute to open source.
So I echo what David was saying. I think one of the things that really encourages good behavior here is that if you had a free rider situation where a company is getting a lot of benefit from a project and not contributing back in an optimal manner, another company can come in and start making those contributions to better steer the project in a direction more suited to their interests. And then it tends to create competitive pressures that encourages everybody to participate and contribute in a way that's going to lead to an optimal outcome for what they're trying to drive. And so the dynamics within the open source projects and the ability for anyone to show up and contribute, and when it's in their own interest to do so, to step up their contributions and allocate resources to best steer the project in a way that's going to match their desired outcomes.
So you think there's already sufficient incentives for that contribution?
So I think these incentives exist today,
Okay.
and it tends to drive resource allocation decisions by companies that are participating with these open source projects.
Okay, thank you.
I have a slightly different viewpoint that I think Log4j for this is really serving to highlight that this is a problem that isn't going to go away. You know, this isn't an open source problem. This is inherently that software will have vulnerabilities regardless of whether or not it's proprietary or open source, and there will always be the potential for those to be found and exploited by attackers. And it serves to highlight the need to do a shift left in security posture, to do a move to more of a zero trust architecture, where we're acknowledging that these things could happen at any given time. So we need to have more robust protections in place where we assume compromise at a base level and then work to be able to quickly isolate those systems and remediate them and work on them when situations like this arise. I think this past year, year and a half, we've seen with Log4j and SolarWinds and the Microsoft Exchange vulnerabilities, we've seen that the cyber threat landscape as a whole is shifting to this being a more commonplace event. And that means from a security posture, we need to shift as well to be able to address that.
Thank you. And Mr. Herr, if you're still with us?
I would concur with David in saying that software in the open source space is offered as is without an expectation of payment. I think that should remain so. Industry has already recognized it's in their self-interest to invest in security and the health of this infrastructure in the long term. There's more than industry can do, but as it stands at the moment, industry efforts already vastly outstrip federal support for this infrastructure. So I think that calling for action on both sides is admirable.
Thank you to each of you, and thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you again for the courtesy.